searching for a high tempo. In you we live and move and breathe. I set my heart on what you do now, here and now, and I won't stop chasing after you.
Everyone joining the rhythm of love. Wherever we run, we move to the beat of our song.
Hands up, love is reaching out to you. Rise up, let the spirit make you move. Light up, feel your grace light up the room. Caught up, yeah.
Now that I know you're never gonna leave me, I can be sure. I know that you see me wherever I go, no matter the road, holding the hope, never gonna stop. Caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm, caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm.
Hands up, love is reaching out to you. Rise up, let the spirit make you move. Light up, feel your grace light up the room. Caught up, yeah. Caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm. Caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm. Caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm. Caught up in the rhythm of your love, caught up in the rhythm.
Hey, my name's Seth, and I just want to welcome you to Church Online today. Especially if it's your first time joining us, we want to extend a warm welcome to you. And excited for the message this morning. But before we get into it, I just want to kind of highlight a few quick announcements, some FYIs, if you will. One is, especially if you're new, I encourage you to take advantage of the prayer request button down at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to know we can be praying with you and for you over the course of this next week. And then also, one of the big events that we got coming up is October 28th down in, or actually up in Newport from 5:30 to 7, and in Walport, October 29th, 5 to 7, we're doing what we're calling our drive-through trunk or treat. And it's really just a great way to sort of love on and bless the families in our community. And if you've never been a part of it, I encourage you to come check it out. It really is a blast. But to pull it off, it literally takes a small army of volunteers. And so we could really use the help. And if you'd be interested in coming out and bringing your car and passing out some candy, maybe even decorating your trunk a little bit, hey, we could use your help. And you can sign up just by going to newport4.org or walport4.org and go to the contact page link and just send us an email saying, hey, sign me up. I'm ready to help out. I'll be there. And just, again, a great event to be a part of. And then finally, just encourage you, if you've yet to check out small groups, fall is, man, it's a perfect time to get connected in a small group. And you can do that by going to, again, one of the websites, just hitting /groups, and you'll find a list of all the available fall small groups to get connected with. Except, we weren't created to go through life alone. like we need some people who are checking up on us, praying for us, just doing life together. And so I encourage you, if you don't already have one of those groups, that support system in your life, hey, I encourage you, fall is a great time to start. We got several groups that are starting to form just now. And again, you can just go to the website, go /groups, and find a list of all those available groups to get connected with. Well, hey, with that, I think it's time to turn the volume up and let's get our worship on today.
I've heard a sound coming on the wind, changing hearts and minds, healing brokenness. I feel a generation breaking through despair. I hear a generation full of faith declare, is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross, you would lay down your life, that I might be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquers the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquers the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquers the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, 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 yeah. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross, you would lay down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me.
Hey, once again, welcome to church. It's so good to have you with us, especially those of you watching online. Excited for today as we're going to be sharing a message that I'm titling That Settles It. That Settles It by unpacking a passage of scripture that starts off in Joshua chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. It says, when Joshua had grown old, not seasoned, not mature, not, like Yoda, like the Lord God just calls it how he sees it. In fact, he goes on to say, you are now very old. Like, isn't that like God? To not sugarcoat things, just to call it how he sees it. And it goes on and says, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. This is the land that remains. As listen, those especially watching online, if you maybe give an amen in the chat box, if there was ever something in your life that you finally got past in your life that you thought you'd never get past. Right? Has there ever been a time in your life you got past something, you got past a struggle, you got past a challenge, maybe an addiction that you thought you finally got through after some time that you never get past? Now, maybe give an amen if you would be also as bold to admit that if a couple years later you found out that what you thought you were past, you actually weren't past at all. Listen, if that's you, I think you can relate to how Joshua would have felt in this moment. As for those who don't know, again, at the time of this writing, Joshua is more than a little seasoned. In fact, most Bible scholars would say he was somewhere between 100 years old and 110. And look, fighting is all he had ever known in life. Like when you turned on his TV, there was no Hallmark movies. Like all he ever watched was Rocky and Braveheart. Like that's all he ever understood. And how discouraging it must have been for Joshua to find out that even though he'd spent a lifetime fighting, that even in his final years, there was still some fighting left to be done. As look, I don't know whose bubble I came to burst today, but maybe you're watching this and maybe you kind of have this romanticized idea of life that like, if I can just get past this struggle, if I can just get past this challenge, if I just get past this obstacle, then my life will just be finally just all rainbows, sunshine, and unicorns. But can I tell you something? Is that how many of you know and how many can testify that even though you're fighting at 15, 16, 17, maybe watching this, that how many know you will still be fighting when you're 50, 60, and 70. Come on. Because the truth is, on the other side of every battle we fight is another battle waiting to be fought. And like that's the bad news. And in life, you're guaranteed to go from fight to fight to fight. Aren't you glad you tuned in this morning, right? But that's the bad news. Here's the good news. Here's the good news. And we find it in verse 6. It says, as for all the inhabitants of the mountain regions from Lebanon to a word I can't even pronounce. It says, as all the Sidonians, I myself will drive them out before the Israelites. See, here's the good news that you've got to get. It's not that we just go from fight to fight to fight, but that we're guaranteed that through God's grace and through God's mercy and through God's strength, we're guaranteed to go from victory to victory to victory. It's what God promises. That if you're willing to do the fighting, God will do the winning. If you're willing to fight through some fear, willing to fight through some doubts, willing to fight through some discouragement, on the other side of that is a promise of victory. Again, if you've got the faith to fight. Sounds like a good title for a sermon, doesn't it? The faith to fight. Come on, you need to get some faith. You need to get some fight in you. But that's not my sermon. That's actually not my sermon, because it turns out that fighting is only half the equation when it comes to seeing the promises of God for your life coming to fruition. Look, I want to talk about the other half of the story, the rest of the story that we find in verse 8. As it says, the other half of Manasseh, the Reubenites and the Gadites, had received the inheritance that Moses had given them east of the Jordan, as he, the servant of the Lord, had assigned to them. Now, just to give you some quick sort of insight, if you will, on sort of the historical and cultural context of the day, you got to understand at this time the nation of Israel was made up of 12 tribes. And 9.5 tribes got their land on the west side of the Jordan, while the other 2.5 tribes, they got their land on the east side of the Jordan. Now, the 9.5 tribes that did not have their land yet still had some fighting to do. But the other half, the remaining tribes, they'd already fought their fight. They'd already fought the good fight of faith. God had already given them the land. In other words, they'd already received what God wanted them to receive. But here's another problem that shows up in this. We see it in verse 13. It says, but the Israelites did not drive out the people of Geshur and Maacah, so they continue to live among the Israelites to this day. In other words, they ended up settling for less than the life God called them to, not because they didn't have the faith to fight, but because they lacked the faith to settle. The faith to settle. To live in what God had called them to. As the problem, again, you got to catch this, of the first 9.5 tribes was that they had most of the land God wanted to give them, but not all the land. But again, get this, the problem for the other 2.5 tribes is that they had all the land that God wanted to give them, but they struggled to make the most of all the land that God gave them. See, what I'm trying to get you to see is he wasn't questioning their will or their faith to fight as much as he was challenging them. Hey, do you have the faith to settle? Do you have the faith to put down some roots, to live in the place I brought you to? Like, I know you got the faith to fight for what God wants to do in your life, but do you have the faith to settle in it? To live in the blessing of what God has done. And here's why this is so important. I put my notes this way. If you don't know the rest of the story, I'm telling you, you'll miss the point of the story. If you don't know the rest of the story, you'll miss the point of the story. A point of the story actually we find in Numbers 33, 52 through 53. As here it's Moses speaking, he almost kind of prophesies, like he realizes that what they think is going to be the toughest part of this fight is actually not the toughest part at all. Like their biggest struggle isn't going to be the fighting, it's going to be the settling. Check this out. It says, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their carved images and their cast idols and demolish all their high places. Take possession of the land and settle in it. Again, put down some roots, live in it, for I've given you the land to possess. By the way, notice he doesn't say settle for, but settle in. Some of us, I think we're settling for less than the kind of life that God has called us to, because we've never learned what it is to really settle in. to settle in his joy, to settle in his peace, to settle in this grace that we have in him. You know, I think in life, I think oftentimes we think the hardest part of the fight is actually getting the blessing, right? And I get why we think this, because in Hollywood, that's when the movie always ends, doesn't it? Like, have you noticed that? Like, they get married happily ever after, and then it's like done. All of a sudden, you get the baby, boom, like, you know, credits roll. A Hallmark movie starts to play. The movie always ends sort of right after they get it, whatever it is, when they get the job, or they get the person, or they get the house. But how many know that's not real life? Like Prince Charming, the one who found this glass slipper for Cinderella, like the hardest part of the movie wasn't getting the girl. But you know what the real hardest part of Prince Charming's life was? It was when the evil stepmother becomes the evil stepmother-in-law. The same evil stepmother-in-law that made Cinderella's life miserable was now going to be making, you know, Prince Charming's life miserable, right? Like, they don't talk about that. That's like in Cinderella 2, right? I don't know, just imagine, like, you know, they put her in a room far away. Which, by the way, to be clear, we're talking stepmother-in-law. My mother-in-law is amazing. So I want to make that clear. Love you, Marilyn. I'm just trying to point out the fact that Hollywood oftentimes wants us to make us think that the goal of life, the goal of the real struggle is the giving. That the happily ever after comes after if I can just get the promotion, or if I can just get the girl, or if I can just get the guy. But how many seasoned Joshuas out there could testify that the real fight, come on, isn't the getting, but it's sometimes getting, but it's actually living in the blessing. It's a living in what God, like the real fight isn't getting into college. The real fight is getting up for a 7 a.m. art history class 3 days a week. Man, those were tough. The real fight, how many know, isn't starting the company. How many know any of you can start a company? Like, you can go on right now while I'm talking. You can start a company, go to LegalZoom, and I don't know, create Larry's Local Ladders. And like suddenly you got a business. See, the real fight isn't starting the business. It's not starting the company. No, the real fight is keeping your customers happy and your employees on payroll. Or for those of you who are retired, how many of you know the real fight isn't getting to retirement? Like, that's a fight. Putting away money, it is a fight. But the real fight is now learning to find purpose without a profession. To find identity without a job. Like, that's a real fight. A fight that, in the words of the great theologian Liam Neeson, is going to require a special set of skills. A special set of skills, and specifically some new skills. Understanding that the same skills you used on the battlefield aren't going to cut it on the harvest field. Case in point, how many parents know that you can't parent your 22-year-old child the same way you parent your 12-year-old? You can't. Like, take away your 12-year-old's Xbox until they get their chores done, and that's just called good parenting. Take away your 22-year-old's Xbox, that's called robbery. Right? Put your 12-year-old in timeout, that's called discipline. You put your 22-year-old in timeout, that's called a hostage situation. See, in other words, God was challenging their faith to settle because he knew that what got them there actually wasn't going to be the skills they needed to actually keep them there. To really make the most out of where they were at now in the season of their life if they didn't learn to develop some new skills. Because something you got to understand, again, about the nation of Israel, these were nomads. They've been nomads for like 40 years. Like they were good when it came to setting up a tent, right? They were good at fighting fights. They were good at swinging swords. They were good at slinging stones, but they never had to build houses before. They never had to plant vineyards before. They never had to create a government. They never had to evict old tenants. And here was the challenge for them, because, it's one thing to fight for a blessing, but again, it's another thing to live in the blessing that God's already given you. And here's why this matters, because if you don't know how to manage the blessing, steward the blessing, appreciate the blessing, and build on the blessing, I'm telling you, you will lose out on what God gave you to live in. You will lose out on what God gave you to live in. As look, I want to share with you 3 skills that we've got to develop, especially if we hope to be settled, even in some unsettled times. How many of you agree we live in some unsettled times? Right? Listen, if you want to have the faith to settle, to be settled even in unsettled times, the first thing you got to get, if you're taking notes, is you got to learn to develop some new routines. A new routine. And look, I get the challenge with this. Like, can you imagine how dull settling down must have first seemed to the Israelites? I mean, who had just gone through the Red Sea, who had seen a bread fall from heaven, he saw water come from a rock, he saw fire from a mountain, again, miracle after miracle, all this amazing stuff, only for God's next command is not to pick up a sword, but, hey, you have the faith to pick up that hammer. You have the faith to start hammering some nails and picking up some rocks and doing some plumbing, right? Like, can you imagine how they had to have felt in that moment? Like, God, are you serious? Like this is what you want me to do in my life? Like, I'm a fighter. I'm a warrior, right? As listen, here's what I found. I put my notes this way. I find that many people have the faith that things will work out, but few people have the faith to work on things. Few people have the faith to work on things, especially the routine things, the ordinary things, the everyday things. And I get it, because getting it, as alluded to before, how many know it's exciting? But building it is boring. Getting it is exciting, but building is boring. You know what's exciting? Getting the house. You know what's not as exciting or as enjoyable? Maintaining the yard. Replacing appliances, which we just had to do. It's super frustrating. You know what's exciting? Getting the job. You know what's not as exciting? Going to bed early the night before so you can get up early so you can keep that job. So you can thrive at that job that God gave you. Listen, it might be boring, but you got to understand it's actually what builds you. Here's another one. Listen, experiencing salvation, how many know that's exciting? That's a big deal. That's a big moment. You know what's not as exciting? Experiencing sanctification. Change on this side of eternity. Because listen, wow, certainly we believe in a big God. We got faith for big things. God can deliver you. He can heal you in a moment. I find that most change, most transformation, especially if it's a lasting change, though, it comes through seemingly monotonous habits that we build day in and day out, habits of going to God, allowing Him to transform us through His Word, transform us through prayer, transform us through gatherings like this, times that might not always seem super exciting, super thrilling. You might not always be passionate to show up to church. But listen, it's in moments like this that God oftentimes starts to create the stage and build up to doing the biggest work in your life. So that's what I'm getting at. Is don't be afraid if big things aren't headed your way. It's not the big things that help you make the most out of the life that you have. It's a commitment. It's faithfulness to do the little things. To do the little things. Like for everyone who's married, I know you think your marriage just needs a vacation. If we could just get away to Iceland or see the Northern Lights, it would be amazing. Like, if we just did that, that would save our marriage. And I get why you think that, because you've got a big thing mentality. But you know what really saves your marriage? Throwing out the garbage. I'm waiting for someone besides Holly to say amen right now. Or doing the dishes. Or telling her that you love her every day before you leave the house. It's the little things that help you to stay in the land, that help you to stay together, that help you to stay in love, that help you to stay sane in a crazy world. You know, interesting enough, and back to sort of this story of them, possessing, going into the promised land. You know what's interesting about this promised land is that back in biblical times, it's topography. The land that He called them to was very intentional in the way that it was formed. As when you think about it, like God could have kept them in Egypt, couldn't He? Like he could have helped them overthrow the Egyptians, but there was a problem with Egypt. Egypt had the Nile River running through it. And like he could have given them Babylon, but there was a problem with Babylon because Babylon had the Tigris River running through it. And God could have given them Assyria, but Assyria had the Euphrates River running through it. Instead he brings them to Israel, this place that has very little bodies of water. Why? Because I think God was trying to use the topography to help shape their theology. See, he wanted them to depend on him, to look to him, because what's interesting about the land there was that this was a place, again, there weren't a lot of rainy seasons. So how they got water were from these fountains. These fountains, and fountains that they would have to go to with these jars that oftentimes would just provide enough water that day. And I think that's significant for a couple of things. One, it spoke something about God. In fact, this is why Jesus refers to himself as, come to me, I have a spring of, in me you'll find a spring of living water. In fact, God is oftentimes referred to in the Psalms as a fountain of life, because it's trying to remind us, listen, in him, when we learn to depend on him, not just every once in a while, but each day go to him, that's where we find true life. That's where we find true peace. That's where we find true joy. But not just that. I don't know if you notice it in a very practical sense. What's it doing? It's establishing a routine. Establishing a routine. He called them to this land because he wanted them to establish a routine of learning to go to him daily, to seek and to find the things that so often we want in life, things like joy, things like satisfaction, things like fulfillment, that it would be found in him. See, if you really want to get the most out of your life, you got to be willing to establish some new routines. Here's the other thing we got to be willing to do, is we got to be willing to develop the skill of a new rhythm. The skill of a new rhythm. Numbers 32:1, because what's interesting is before this scene that we read of earlier in the passage, is that this was a place, like when they're talking about, kind of going in, was settling in the promised land, you understand this was a place they had been before. And they'd been at this moment, this place before earlier. In fact, we see in Numbers 32:1, and it says, the Reubenites and Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the community and said, the land the Lord subdued before the people of Israel are suitable for livestock. And your servants have livestock. If we have found favor in your eyes, he said, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan. Interpretation, this will do. Good enough. Right? Like, the reason why is all those years before they would actually really step into the promised land is this right here. And you sit there and realize, like, why? Like, what would keep you from just settling for less than what God calls you to? And I think the simple answer is kind of found in this kind of description right at the beginning. It said they had very large herds and flocks. In other words, here's the thing, is that I want you to get, is that you got to understand, these were people who were traveling all the time. They had kids, they had families. And so here they are, they're trying to balance a lot of work, balance all these herds, balance their job, balance traveling, balance getting the kids up to hit the road. Like it's a challenge sometimes just to get, Austin up and going. I think, to come to church, like Holly and I would be there, like, hey, come in. You're ready to go. Come on. It's time to go. Like, you didn't do your hair. Like, your buttons aren't done. Like, your shirt's out of place. Like that's the wrong shoes. And listen, that's just me. This is me. You're trying to get ready. Yeah. It's not even Austin. And again, so here we have them that they're struggling. They're exhausted trying to balance everything. Trying to balance their work, trying to balance their life, trying to balance their schedule. And as a result, this exhaustion, listen, I believe was the very thing that kept them from willingness to basically settle for less than God called them to, rather than stepping into what God called them to live in. Because they were exhausted. they were tired. And listen, I wonder how many of us that can be said for our lives as well. If the thing that maybe is really kind of keeping us from really living and making the most of the life God's called us to live is this right here, the sense of exhaustion. In fact, I put my notes this way. It's what if the life you're living is the greatest enemy to the life you want? Or what if the life you're living, the pace you're living, is the greatest enemy to the life you want? Because let's be honest, how many of us, just like the nation of Israel, we live for balance. We live for a balance. But you got to understand something, is that God never called us to balance or to find rest, certainly, in balance. He called us to find rest and rhythm. And those are two different things. Because you know what balance sounds like? Balance sounds like I'm overwhelmed. Balance sounds like I'm exhausted. In fact, you want to know what like perfect balance sounds like? Perfect balance sounds like this. In fact, I think we got a video clip here. That is perfect balance. When do you hear that in life? Yeah. Here's another one now. This is the sound of rhythm. Yeah. Jerry said this is hard. Yeah. So I also that's a pretty strong heartbeat, right? But there's rhythm there. There's rhythm there. And in fact, what's interesting is in God, when He calls us to establish rhythm, to define rest out of rhythm, not balance, He doesn't describe it as rhythm. He describes it as establishing what's known as a Sabbath, the Shabbat, if you will. In fact, we read of this in Exodus 31, 12 through 13 and 15. It says, "And then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." And then catch this, for 6 days, work is to be done. By the way, for some of you, the reason you're struggling to find rest and feel so unsettled is because there is some work to be done. Like when we talk about creating a rhythm of rest, it's not creating a rhythm of doing nothing. Like there is a time to work. There's a time to put some effort in. But it goes on and says, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest. Sabbath is holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath is to be put to death. Now, it seems a little extreme. Like, thank goodness we don't live in a day where people are out throwing stones trying to put us to death. Like, that's the good news in terms of that. But here's the bad news. It doesn't change the reality that people die all the time from ignoring this command that God has given us. Case in point. There was a study done in Japan some years ago of a man in the study who was just simply referenced as Mr. A. Mr. A, right? Not Mr. T, Mr. A. And so he had worked several years at a major Japanese snack food processing company, putting in as many, catch this, as 110 hours in a work week. 110. Let me break that down for you. You'd have to work to actually do this in your life. You'd have to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week to do this same type of schedule. And so they're studying him to kind of find out the effects of sort of this extreme work, this extreme schedule, this extreme busyness on somebody's life. Too much to their surprise, and I think in some ways kind of disappointment, is that when they came in, after a few weeks of studying this guy, they came in one of the mornings to find that he was dead at his workstation. Look, here's why I bring this up. Is that I find, so we live in a culture that's more than willing to sort of sit by and watch society kind of work itself to death, if you allow us. If you allow. In fact, I put in my notes this way. So you got to understand, either you'll take a break in life or life will break you. This is why Sabbath is so important. I think sometimes we give a little pushback on this. Like, come on, do I really need to take a break? It seems, and I think part of the reason we do pushback on it is because it's a command. I remember growing up, one of the things I hated was when my parents would sit there and tell me, I'd ask why. Why do you want me to take out the trash? Because we said so. Anyone else have that parent? Yeah. Apparently I'm not the only one with those parents. Yes, yeah. Because he said so. And here's something you got to understand about God. is that when God commands us to do something, when He asks you to do something, do you realize that it's never for His benefit, it's always for yours? I mean, do you ever think about that? Like, it's never like He's not asking for you to take a break once a week because, like, He needs some me time. He needs just a moment, a Calgon moment away from all of your problems and all your issues. No, it's for your benefit. It's because He wants to bless you. He wants you to be able to live at a rhythm that isn't just reflective as a sign of life, but actually the source of life. To bring some joy and to bring some refreshment. And look, before you start to kind of read into this too much, because part of the reason also we don't tend to preach on Sabbath and we don't hear about it a lot in church is because, a lot of times we made it into something that's not. Or we made it into a legalistic thing or a religious thing. But here's what Sabbath simply is. In fact, Sabbath literally just means rest. It just means rest. It's about being intentional about creating a day, creating some space where you just rest, and specifically rest from the things that are work to you. So let me put it in a more practical way. So if you're an accountant on your Sabbath, listen, it's about taking some time to just not do any accounting. Like, if you're a doctor on a Sabbath, you want to be serious about really embracing and really enjoying and stepping into the blessing that's found in this rest. Listen, if you're a doctor, you don't operate it. You don't play the game operation. Like, you just take a break. If you're a preacher, you don't preach. I get frustrated. I got talk about church stuff on a Sabbath. If you're a clown, I don't know, you don't clown that day, right? I don't know, maybe you're not serious that whole day. I don't want to see a smile on your face this entire day. I don't know how that works, but listen, I'm just trying to get to that. Look, man, Sabbath. Again, He's not, it's not trying to get something from you. It's something He wants for you. In fact, Mark 2:27, Jesus put it this way: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. See, God He wants you to take a break, because I think you understand something we got to get is that as long as you're working on it, whatever it is, you don't have time to enjoy it. As long as you're always working on the marriage, as long as you're always working on the relationship, as long as you're always trying to work on your kids or work on the job, you never have the time to really enjoy it. Listen, you got to add some rhythm, God's march in your life. I like how 1 Kings 8:56 or 58 in the Message speaks. It says, blessed be God, who has given peace to His people, Israel. Just as He said He'd do, not one of all those good and wonderful words that He spoke through Moses has misfired. May God, our very own God, continue to be with us just as He was with our ancestors. May He never give up and walk out on us. May He keep us centered and devoted to Him, following the life path He has cleared, watching the signposts, catch us walking at the pace and rhythms He laid down for our ancestors. Listen, how's your rhythm today? Are you walking in a godly rhythm, a rhythm that is sustainable? Sustainable. Listen, don't seek balance. That'll wear you out. Seek rhythm. And then the last skill you got to develop, wrap up with this, is you got to get a new reason. Or maybe probably better said, a renewed reason. A renewed reason for this season. In fact, I like how it speaks as Joshua 13:6 says, be sure to allocate this land to Israel for an inheritance. In other words, what's it getting at? Simply put, you've been blessed to be a blessing. Listen, God has blessed you to ultimately be a blessing to others. See, if we got to really make the most out of this life, make the most out of the seasons we're in life, you got to understand it's not just about what you don't do, but it's also what you choose to do. What you choose to do. Because how many know, like you can go on vacation and do nothing, and yet how many of you ever return from that vacation like you need a vacation from the vacation? Like you're more tired than ever before? It's because, listen, real rest isn't found simply in what you don't do, but it's in the things that you choose to do. Like there's a rest that's found when you do things that have a greater purpose than just you. In fact, Jesus spoke of Himself. He said, take my yoke upon you. It's light and easy. And he goes on to say, listen, in that listen, you'll find rest. Again, it's this rest that's actually found in purposeful work, and things that actually last beyond just you. See, if you don't have the faith to settle, you can't just have the faith to do little things, faith to do less things. You just gotta have the faith to do some lasting things. I like how Ephesians 5:16 puts it, so don't waste your time on useless work and your busy work, the barren pursuits of darkness. Don't be fools, be wise, make the most of every opportunity you have for doing good. Yeah, for doing good. In other words, listen, you've been blessed ultimately to bless others. And yet I get why a lot of us struggle to really embrace that call, to really step into that purpose. I think it's the same reason that the nation of Israel really struggled to see it for what it was. In fact, again, there's that interesting text where it says that they allowed the Gadites and a few others to stay living with them. To stay living with them, which I find really fascinating. Really, when I read it, it really struck me and kind of lead you really to come with this question. Is, listen, what are some things that you have chosen to live with that's keeping you from really living in? Or should I say, living out God's purpose for your life? A past that you're living with, a regret you're living with, a discouragement, a disappointment you're living with, that's keeping you from living out this legacy purpose, this divine purpose, living out God's, the blessing that God's given you to ultimately bless others. There was a story of a guy by the name of Alfred that I read recently, and Alfred, lived some time ago, and he woke up and he read the morning obituaries. He kind of got to that point in life, like any older folks. Anyone willing to admit that they've gotten to the point in life they find themselves checking the obituaries every once in a while, see if friends are still around, right? Well, that's kind of what he's doing. He's reading it when he comes across his name, right? His name, because what had happened was his brother had actually passed away the night before, but they mistakenly thought it was him. So they put in the obituary Alfred Noble. And so to make matters worse, like they describe his life, like they thought it was him who had actually died. And so they describe him as literally the merchant of death. Because Alfred Noble, what you got to understand about him, he was the inventor of dynamite. Now at this time, dynamite had killed more people than just about anything else during that time, especially when you added in the accidental deaths connected to it. And so here he's reading this obituary that is incredibly negative, just talking about how he's a merchant of death, kind of the root cause of so much of the problems going on in the world that day. And so he actually gets a call from his attorney because he made some money being the quote-unquote merchant of death. And the attorney's like, hey, we can sue. Like they're liable on this. Like this is, they can't just drag your name across the mud. When Alfred Noble responds to me, goes, I would if what they were saying wasn't true. Because reality is, I can't deny the things that are in that obituary. And yet what's so cool about Alfred Noble's life is that in that moment, he chose to make a decision. He chose to make a decision to live his life for something bigger than himself. To live his life something bigger than what he was known for, to actually change the course, change his legacy. Not wanting to be remembered as a merchant of death, he wanted to be known as someone who actually advanced peace. By taking all the money he once used to resource others for war, choosing to instead help fund those who promoted projects of peace. Writing this, and so he'd go on to live about 10 more years, and right before he died, he would end up penning these words, writing, I love this thing, it says, every man ought to have the chance to correct his obituary in midstream and writing it. I love that. See, what are you living with that's keeping you from living in, or should I say living out, a bigger purpose than just yourself? God's promise, the ways he's blessed you, that he blessed you to ultimately bless others. And again, I get the pushback, like you don't understand. You don't understand the past I carry, the regrets I've got. But listen, if Alfred Noble's life reminds us of anything, is that you might not be able to choose the legacy you inherited, but you do get to choose the legacy you leave. You get to choose it. Listen, I don't care what the past you're living with, the regret you're living with, the disappointment you're living with. Listen, if you give it over to God, listen, through His grace and through His mercy, He can turn that around and use it for His good and ultimately His glory. But you got to be willing to take a step. You got to be willing to, again, create not just new routines, new rhythms, but for some of you, live for a new reason beyond just yourself and your convenience and your comfort. I want to pray for you today. And Father, I do just lift up those, especially those who maybe are watching this, maybe here now and struggling with yeah, I get that God's called me to live a life of victory. He's called me to live in joy, live in peace, but I'm struggling. I'm struggling with the things that I'm living with. Like there's some things I'm living with I feel like are keeping me from living with. There is some discouragement I've been living with. There's some failure I've been living with. There's some disappointment I've been living with. But listen, can I encourage you, if the gospel reminds us of anything, is that past you've been living with, that disappointment you've been living with that's been keeping you from living in the place God's called you to live in, a place of joy and peace and contentment. Listen, you don't have to keep living there anymore. But by His grace, His word reminds us in 2 Corinthians that His grace is sufficient. It's enough. It's enough for all of my failures and all my disappointments. Now, when I give it to Him, He can turn it around. He's a redeemer, which means He can take even the worst of things, even the garbage of my life and the ashes of my life. Touching every heart, I worship you.